What is the most expensive or historically significant item to ever be destroyed? The Parthenon remained largely intact for about 1000 years until it was hit by an artillery shell in 1687. Ditto for the monastery at Monte Cassino, which was bombed to rubble in WW2. The Allies also bombed the Santa Maria del Grazie church in Milan where Da Vinci painted the Last Supper, but fortunately it only resulted in minor damage. The Santa Maria del Grazie didn't suffer minor damage, only the Last Supper fresco survived, because it was covered with sandbags. The rest of the chapel walls are blank now because of the destruction. The golden spruce, a tree on the Queen Charlotte Island that was sacred to the Aboriginals and a genetic anomaly, only one ever found, was cut down by a logger, in protest of logging. I really want to hear his reasoning behind that protest. Something of note, Nam Demon in Seoul. For a country that has been treated pretty badly by all of its neighbors and its own people, physical cultural pieces are few and far between. Nam Demon was one of the few really old structures left in Seoul, let alone Korea. It was burned down by a Korean man who was outraged, and rightfully so, at the Gov taking his land. That being said, it's pretty freaking stupid to get your revenge on the government by burning one of the last physical heritage pieces left in your culture. I was in Korea in May and was shocked that over 90% of the historical sites are rebuilt or replicas of their ancient counterparts. What wasn't destroyed by Japan, almost everything because their goal was to erase all remnants of Korean culture, was bombed during the Korean War. It was just so sad. A culture just as old and rich as China's with almost nothing to show for it. It wasn't really destroyed, but the fact that Einstein's last words aren't known because the nurse that was with him didn't know German is pretty sad. Actually, dying people don't usually have all that much interesting things to say in my experience. I think the lore of last words are largely made up by history and family of the dead. The 1,700-year-old giant Buddha statues that were blown up by the Taliban. Seriously, frick them for doing that. One of the Buddha statues was 165 feet tall, and they simply blew it up using dynamite. The sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols. Although it's not an item, the river was said to run black with ink. Major bummer. Baghdad seems fine now though. The siege of Baghdad was in 1258, and according to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, the city did not recover its population until the 1900. The sack of Rome in 455 AD by the Vandals. You know it's bad when the name of your tribe is used for the rest of history to describe hooligans. We don't know. The Cultural Revolution in China, Stalin's purges, Cromwell's reformers made big piles and torched them, and we'll never really know how much we're missing. Templo Mayor. Cortes showed up in Tenochtitlan and tore the entire freaking thing down, and then used the stones to build a cathedral. This is the equivalent to Alexander the Great showing up in Giza, then tearing down one of the ancient pyramids in order to erect a statue of his dong. That gigantic blow diamond that experts say was stolen, recut, and now lives in the Smithsonian. The Hope Diamond. It is now known as, in its smaller form. Definitely not the most valuable in terms of practical worth, but still it hurts me in my wallet to think about mutilating one of the largest diamonds in history. I believe that old woman dropped it off the boat at the end of Titanic. Well, maybe not the most, but when the Spaniards came to Central America they destroyed every historical proof of the Mayans, including books, scriptures and all of that kind of things, except for the Popol Vuh, which is a book written in Mayan language. They did it because it was the devil. Though it's still a theory, the Ark of the Covenant was most likely dismantled, destroyed, one of the most sought after and important artifacts in history. If I recall correctly, Indiana Jones saved it from the Nazis, so it's okay. The Archimedes Codex, which could have potentially sent humans hundreds of years into the future in the mathematics world. It was erased and written over by a monk, and only until recently was deciphered using digital imaging. The solid gold capstones and limestone exterior to the Giza pyramids really surprised him, the only one to mention the stripping of the greatest achievement in relation to the level of human development at the time. To be fair, the pyramids were looted relatively soon after they were constructed. That's why the burial chambers of all the future pharaohs were located in the Valley of the Kings. For me, it has to be the pyramids at Giza. Although they still stand, they are but a fraction of how amazing they used to look. Apparently, they were cased by highly polished white limestone and the top points of the pyramids were cased in gold. Must have been one heck of a sight on a clear night with a full moon. That's hard question to answer because Priceless is priceless. Probably the burnings of the various libraries, Baghdad by the Mongols, Alexandria by the Romans or the Muslims, would come to mind as particularly expensive, as books were extremely valuable until the printing press. If you want to talk non-inflation adjusted value of a single something deliberately destroyed, probably the Mir space station, as it cost something like $4 billion to make and was deliberately deorbited into destruction. The WTC and some buildings come into the billions range, but not that much. The ISS when it is deorbited, will be a $130 or $140 billion thing being junked in the Pacific. Inflation adjusted is really hard to say because it's hard to know how to count the cost of something. Buddhist statues in Afghanistan, cathedrals in Germany and Italy and Poland and Russia, and all of those historical buildings. Some of the great ships of history which were, particularly the new ones, deliberately salvaged because they were unsuitable to keep afloat, had huge costs. Do you count design costs in something like this? I guess. For things where only one was made, but that's not a trivial calculation to do. Do you want to count earthquakes and tsunamis in destroyed or just man-made? The tsunami that wiped out most of Lisbon in 1588, the Boxing Day earthquake off Indonesia a couple of years ago, any of those things which obliterated old temples etc. were hugely destructive, but you can't even put a price on them really. Robert Capa film. All of his rolls of film he shot while landing on Omaha Beach on day with the soldiers, and they ruined his film while trying to develop it, all but 11 images. The Spaniard burning of tens of thousands of codices in the Aztec, and later Maya, libraries, containing thousands of years of history, science, and medical knowledge. I'd have to go Mali Empire. I would say Western Roman but that more eroded. The Mali Empire, home to Mansa Musa, the wealthiest human in history, as well as the University of Sankore, was one of the wealthiest trading empires the world had ever seen. A fundamentalist army came in and swept the whole thing into the Sahara. The worth of gold mines is only in its production. You can't eat gold. The trade empire made incredible wealth for the entire pre-fiat currency world. Other than the Library of Alexandria, it would be the Canadian-built plane the Avro Arrow. Years ahead of its time, it was shut down by the Canadian government at the insistence of the US. There was no plane in the world even close. The designers and engineers all went to work for the American aircraft history, and the rest is history. Well, if you believe the story, in a hissy fit suitable to a 5-year-old, Moses destroyed the only known writings from the creator of the universe. Then again, John Smith just lost much the same, and his were written on gold pages. I guess those prophets are just a clumsy group, or something. Joseph Smith. The Temple of Artemis was burned down by a man named Herostratus just so that his name would be remembered. I have to commend him because it worked. The sentencing for him was damnatio memoriae, which is where they erase all historical records of him. It would have worked except for Theopompus, who recorded it in his History Hellenics. This is one of my favorite stories from antiquity. It's crazy to think people are still doing this. If one is considering not only strictly economic value but environmental and cultural value too, the Mega Rice project in Kalimantan, Indonesia, was pretty disastrous in what it managed to destroy in one fell swoop. The mega project was an unmitigated disaster. Not one blade of productive rice was ever grown there, in spite of the removal of at least 500,000 hectares of primary peat swamp forest, the extermination of around 5,000 orangutan and myriads of other wildlife, and the creation of more than 4,600 kilometers of channels. By the time the project was abandoned, major damage had been done to the regional and global environment. Forestry resources had been ransacked, government money had been misappropriated, and the economy and quality of life of indigenous people had been irreparably disrupted. Not the most expensive or most historically significant, but Steri Most in Bosnia was a freaking crime against history. Built in 1566 by the Ottomans, it was the widest man-made arch on earth at that time. The engineering was a marvel. On November 9, 1993, Croatian military forces blew the bridge up. It had stood for 427 years. After the war, divers recovered as much of the original stonework from the river as possible. It was rebuilt and reopened in July 2004. It's back, but it's not the original. I've been to Mostar. The bridge is truly beautiful, but it's not the original. I love Croatia and its people, but blowing up the bridge was a real dong move. I went to Croatia and Bosnia for the first time in 11 years last summer. I went to Steri Most as well. I was there as a child. I'm originally Croatian and got to see the original. Beautiful. Such a shame what happened. There's still so much division in Mostar. It's unbelievable. I was worried for Leptis Magna during the Libyan crisis, particularly considering there were reports of Gaddafi and company hiding tanks in amidst the ruins and speculation that NATO would be forced to attack it. Honest, they are the very best preserved Roman ruins in the entire world. They make the Colosseum and Forum look like chump change. The British wanted to roll tanks across it during World War II, and it was two archaeologists, artillerymen, who really stuck to their guns and said frick that. Drive around you cockbags, that kept it from being damaged. From my understanding, before the Mongol Empire came around, the Middle East was one of the most culturally and scientifically advanced civilizations. But apparently their civilization got ravaged. Cities like Baghdad got leveled. The Mongols burned books, libraries, hospitals, and there are even claims that the Euphrates River ran black with ink for several days. The Middle East got freaked up so badly that they still haven't recovered, and that's why countries like Iraq are in such a state of disarray. While not a single item, I think this destruction is a very significant historical event. Many of the problems in the Middle East are a result of the loss of their literature and culture, and we still deal with these problems in the modern day. So here's the scary thing. Destroying the history of political opponents and other cultures has been standard procedure of conquerors since, well, since history was a thing. You should expect that the conquerors of thousands of years ago behaved in much the same way that the Taliban, the Nazis, or the conquistadors behaved. Destroying whole peoples and all their written records was the usual thing for ancient empires. The bare fragments and shards of ancient history that we possess are either those that the conquerors approved of, or those they missed. Some related thoughts. Fully half of all humans who have ever lived have been female. But until relatively recently, with few exceptions, anything that a woman did was not history. Which isn't to say that she didn't do anything important. Rather, that what she did has been filtered out of the message we've received. Sometime between when she lived and today, humanity originated in sub-Saharan Africa. Writing was probably invented in India. Most of the ancient history most folks in the US ever hear of begins in Egypt and peaks in ancient Athens, Rome, and Judea. What about all those other folks? The ancient Western Europeans wrote in runes on wood. Yeah, wood doesn't last as well as stone and clay do. Same with the ancient Africans and lots of other places. I'm a bit late, so this will probably get buried, but the largest gold nugget found during California's gold rush is believed to be a 195-pound, not sure if troy or not, quartz-laced mass. At today's closing price of $1,256.90 Oz troy, and 2,340 ounces it would fetch $2,941,146 at spot price, and specimen pieces are generally worth many times more than spot. For example, in 2011 a 100-ounce T-nugget was sold at auction for $400,000 when the spot price of the day was $1,396.10. Nearly 300% more than its spot price of $139,610. Following that math, which is completely hypothetical, that 195-pound nugget could today be worth nearly $8,500,000. Unfortunately, specimen gold was not a concept when the nugget was found, and it was smelted and poured into bars along with the rest of the gold mined during that era. The nugget was found in Morgan Mine on Carson Hill in Calaveras County. HMS Dreadnought. This ship revolutionized the way battleships were built and kicked off the British-German naval race that was one of the major reasons for World War I. Prior to this, most battleships were built with a mishmash of different caliber guns, with the theory being that as the distance between ships decreased, the increased rate of fire from the smaller guns would outweigh their lack of range. However, at the Battle of Tsushima, the ships never closed within range of the smaller guns, and thus demonstrated decisively the need for an all-big guns battleship, or the Dreadnought as they would later be called. Until Pearl Harbor, these ships remained the core of the navies of all the major world powers, and a major jewel in the crown of all the dawn wavers of the day, as well. Since this ship left all previous battleships obsolete overnight, it suddenly became necessary to build a whole new fleet of ships, effectively catching the German Empire up in number of modern ships, which left the British public quite afraid, as the fact of British naval dominance had been unquestionable for the previous century, and suddenly if they could be bested on the high seas, they could be invaded in the home islands. So that meant that the Germans and British, the two biggest European powers of the time, were now going head to head in a race to see who could build a bigger fleet. So with those two firmly off at one another, all they needed was an excuse to duke it out. Along comes a certain anarchist in Sarajevo, and the rest is history. After all this, it was sold for scrap in 1920. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.